Well, hello and welcome to the Institute of Managers and Leaders, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're absolutely delighted to host our second National Salary Survey webinar for 2020 after we launched it in late May. Today we want to look through 10 years of salaries. The Institute's proud that the National Salary Survey has been going for 56 years, and we often at the end of a decade, having said that I haven't been here at the end of a decade before, but what usually happens is we provide a 10-year in review and look at some of the events and activities that change the nature of the economy and hence change the nature of the direction of salaries and HR policies in which organisations take forward to maintain, to retain and obviously look after their staff. So thank you very much once again for joining us. It's going to be a great session. I would say at the outset, please, if you've got questions, please type them through and we will come to a question and answer session at towards the end of today's session. Someone who has been a part of the NSS for 10 years is not myself. I'm Sam Bell, I'm the General Manager of Corporate Services, but someone who has been a part of the National Salary Survey for close to 10 years is Charles Go, and he manages our National Salary Survey. And Charles, I'm delighted to welcome you today.
Thank you very much, Sam. Glad to be here.
How long have you been on the National Salary Survey, Charles, just to clarify?
You're absolutely right. I just hit the 11-year mark last month. So, yeah, it's been
so you've seen that. Yes. So normally Charles and I are in the same room, but obviously due to COVID-19 and the restrictions, Charles is locked up in Sydney and I'm in Brisbane. So we're doing it remotely, but Charles, 11 years, fantastic. So I could let you do this whole webinar because you've seen the decade through from the prism of the National Salary Survey, where salaries have gone and what different HR policies have obviously been in favour at various times through the decade. So we'll certainly rely on your expertise throughout today. So welcome, Charles. A little bit about the Institute of Managers and Leaders before we get going. Obviously, we do manage the National Salary Survey and have done for 56 years, but more importantly than that, for almost 80 years, the Institute has been the peak body for managers and leaders across Australia and New Zealand. So we provide two key things. That's a membership network. That's an opportunity to join like-minded professionals who are in management and leadership roles, where we bring you regularly together to talk about the challenges that you face and also to network and learn from each other. The second part is a formal ongoing professional development curriculum. So we offer fortnightly complimentary webinars, masterclasses with small groups of managers and leaders, right up to 12-week leadership programs. So the Institute does offer that continuous professional development if you're a manager or a leader and looking to develop yourself and also build your network of like-minded professionals. And as I said, for 80 years, we've been the Institute of Managers and Leaders for Australia and New Zealand, and also part of those years, as I said, for 56, have been running the National Salary Survey to support broadly senior management, but also HR professionals manage their way through the tough job of keeping staff happy and retaining your staff, because at the end of the day, they are your biggest asset in your business. So obviously that's the ambition of what the Institute does, and certainly how we try to operate the National Salary Survey is give that insight for HR professionals to really make the right decisions in their organisation. So if you've got any inquiries about the Institute at all, please get in touch with us. We'll have details at the end of the webinar, or certainly send through a question through the question box and we can answer that in due course. But thank you very much once again for attending, and let's get cracking on today's webinar. So the National Salary Survey, as I said, for 56 years, we've been producing it. Charles, if you would like to, as the very accomplished and experienced National Salary Survey professional, run through a little bit more about what it entails.
Sure thing, Sam. Thank you. So the National Salary Survey is a salary benchmarking tool. We collect data from hundreds of organizations, and that data ends up representing about 22,000 employees Australia-wide. The salary survey has over 220 position titles that we report on. We only report on data that we do have enough positions that we do have data for. So anything that comes under less than 5 cases, we don't report on that as it's too unreliable. And even then, we still want to keep our number of cases per position quite high, because that gives us a more robust and reliable source. So the salary survey is not only just HR, not only salaries, but we also do ask questions, those important questions about companies' HR policies and benefits. This enables organizations who have the salary survey to create those engaging benefits, those engaging policies and those packages in order to keep their staff happy. Now, the salary survey comes in a hard copy and an online portion. So the hard copy is a really thick booklet that's quite handy to have on your desk as a resource. And also the online database is what you receive as well. With the online database, you can download the PDF versions of the hard copy, so it's quite easy, quite portable. So when you're traveling, when you're going from office to office, you don't have to carry that heavy thing around. You can actually just easily log in, download what you need, and then have the resources just at your fingertips. But we also have an interesting tool online, the Analyze Data tool, which enables you to create filters for each position title that you're looking at, and use those filters in order to pinpoint the salary data that you need for your specific organization's criteria. So whether you're looking for just something in New South Wales or something in the manufacturing industry, or if that your company is just within the 50 to 100 number of employees level, you can actually select those criteria in order to fit your needs. Now, throughout the year, apart from the salary survey, which also gets updated in October, released in May and updated in October, we also release additional insights. So from the questions that we asked for the salary survey, we create what we call the staff retention report, which is basically the staff retention rate. So we break it down by your industry, location, and company size as well, similar to the salary data. And then we also go through the different policies and benefits that affect staff retention. What are the organizations that have the higher staff retention rates, and what do they do in order to keep that? And also, what are the ones with low staff retention rates, and what is it that they're missing out on? Therefore, you can again create your really engaging packages, really engaging benefits for your employees. We also create a gender pay report, which is what we do is compare males and females and what their average salaries are and find the different gaps. And then throughout every other month, we also have a salary survey newsletter that's available to anyone who's registered with the salary survey, and that will just give you interesting articles, interesting findings that we see throughout working with our corporate clients, and articles and blog posts that we release as IML, and gather that for you and keep you up to date and just have that in your fingertips. And finally, for those organizations that have your unique or hybrid roles that your typical salary surveys don't quite have data on, we do have a remuneration consulting service. So we work very closely with a REM consultant who we worked with in the last more than a decade now, actually, probably about close to 15 years now. And what he can do is basically ask those right questions, find out what it is that this specific role does, compares that to the rest of the data that we do have, and be able to extract a salary band for that specific role. So it's quite a handy service to use. We do have that available for you if you do need that. And that's the salary survey in a nutshell.
Thanks, Charles. And a lot of that we will go through today in terms of some of those key outcomes from those insight reports as well. So a very thorough report that Charles has managed for the last decade. So there's no better person to look at the decade in review, Charles.
Thanks, Sam. So yes, it's been a kind of an interesting decade. A lot has happened, and these events around the world, events that happen within Australia and overseas, they have an effect. They definitely have an effect on the economy, definitely have an effect on society, and in turn definitely has an effect on the workplace and salaries. So I thought it'd be interesting to just have a look at what happened in the last 10 years. Starting with Occupy Wall Street, which happened in 2011 at the start of the decade. this is quite an interesting time where protesters were marching against the inequality and influence of Wall Street on the rest of society. Then we moved on to the Black Lives Matter movement, which started in 2013. This was in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who was shot and killed by and killed an unarmed black teen, Trayvon Martin, in 2012. This is quite an interesting era, and obviously the Black Lives Matter movement has been pushing through throughout the decade, and now even more so in the last few months, really. Next, we've got Brexit, which happened in 2016. Obviously, that's the UK moving away from the EU. Obama stepping down and Trump stepping up as the president of the United States. There's also been a lot of natural disasters that's happened. The earthquakes, hurricanes, and of course the bushfires in Australia. There's also been, unfortunately, a lot of terrorist attacks and mass shootings in America and throughout the world. Quite sad events happening out there. But then some good news is that LGBTI rights advances with the legalization of same-sex marriages in 18 countries now, which is quite interesting. That's a really positive movement. The advancement in popularity of smart devices, causing social media to be a new and interesting, better way of connecting, raising awareness for things, and conducting business as well. So there's been a lot of things that have happened over the last decade, and it's certainly been an interesting relation to the salaries that we've seen in the salary survey.
I would also, Charles, in looking at that, say, there's obviously been a lot of one-off sort of events that have created ripples through the economy. The economy now is so globally connected, as we've seen with the coronavirus pandemic of recent times, that it's a contagion, and I think the decade, as you said, started really coming out of the global financial crisis. And what we'll see in a number of the stats, I think, looking through it is that rise, that growth out of really a recessionary period right across the world, probably except for Australia, after the global financial crisis, and those effects from say 2008, 2009 were still lingering as we started that decade. So I do think that's happened, and certainly one thing we haven't put in there that's probably more relevant for Australia that has created instability is political leadership through the decade. We've had 5 prime ministers in the decade. Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd came back for a short time, Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, and Scott Morrison at the end of the decade. So 5 prime ministers in 10 years, which has never been seen before in Australia. Typically, we've had a lot of stability at a political leadership level, certainly in the previous 20 years before that, having 3 prime ministers in 20 years. So to have 5 in a decade certainly created some localized uncertainty in probably more the smaller to medium-sized business market, with the uncertainty around some of those key policies that are still floating around the political environment.
That's right. I was going to put that in there, Sam, but I thought jumping into politics is a dangerous thing to do when it comes to Australian politics.
That's all right. So moving on to the salary trend. So what we've tried to do, and what Charles has done, is really try to pull out some of the key data that perhaps has been driving certainly the narrative across salary growth and also HR policies over the decade, and to highlight how organisations perhaps have adapted to those changing environment and implemented new policies at a workplace level for their staff that have really been forced on organisations. And we'll talk a little bit about those later, but it's very interesting to extrapolate the data out and have a look at these trends developing, and certainly Charles has tried to, as I said, pull together some of those key data. So we might firstly have a look at the salary growth and inflation numbers first, Charles.
Yeah.
So what we see here is salary growth throughout the decade has largely outstripped the inflation rate. And as I said just a little bit earlier, the global economy was really coming out of that global recession from the financial meltdown, which happened in the late 2008, 2009, where we were seeing really higher inflation rates of around 3%, which back then was seen as a normal inflation rate, right down to an inflation rate today of it'd be lucky if it's 1.8%. And I think that's representative of, we say, the new normal. No one really quite knows whether it is a new normal, but certainly I think we live in a world with much lower inflation. Having said that, there's a lot of things that are going up far higher than 1.8%. Things like education costs, things like healthcare costs are going up much higher than 1.8%. But in general, the inflation rate has fallen through the decade. And likewise, the salary rates. And as we said, 2011, 2012 were really the highs of salary growth for Australia and for what the National Salary Survey picked up. So it peaked at around 4.1%, and it plateaued in 2017 about 2.8%, as you can see on the graph there. Consistently higher than inflation, which is a good thing. It means that wages are keeping track with the rising cost of goods. But as we can see through the decade, it really has fallen away, certainly inflation rates and salary growth rates, which is something of a concern for us looking at the National Salary Survey. And we probably see this, we get a lot of questions from National Salary Survey purchasers and organisations who contribute to the survey saying, where do we see it going? And we probably see it going lower, if that makes sense. We continue to see inflation rates, particularly the world is in a pretty nasty recession right now, and we probably haven't probably seen the real effects of that recession. But inflation is expected to fall, growth is expected to fall, and thus we think salary growth is potentially expected to fall below that 3% mark. I would add, though, that there are a number of job roles and there are a number of industries where salaries are going up far higher than that. We will look at some of those shortly, but that is something to be very keenly aware of, because you don't want to be caught out by increasing salaries for your staff at what you think is the common rate across the economy. Needless to say that you'll start losing staff because they're getting paid higher at other organisations based on the demand for that particular role. And we'll certainly look at some of those roles shortly. But as you can see through the decade, things have sort of tailed away, and as we leave the decade, running into really a pandemic to start this new decade is a very, very tough start. But having said that, as we entered this earlier decade, it was coming out of the global financial crisis, which had a really global recessionary impact as well. So it's interesting to see where it goes, but we certainly expect it to go a little bit lower before it goes any higher. Charles, have you got any further comments on that?
No, I think you covered it quite well.
Okay, well, let's move to industries, Charles, and
certainly. So here what we've done here is broken down the average salary growth and segregated into various different industries. And what I'll do is it's a really messy chart here, but we'll go over the different industry areas in the next couple of slides. I just wanted to go over this in a little bit just to highlight the fact that even though salaries have been declining, salary growth has been declining from 2012 to 2017 consistently, the industries are actually following suit, and then all of them are kind of declining along with it as well. Probably the big would be that you can see obviously is in 2017, where the business professional services has shot up a lot higher than other ones, and that's quite an interesting thing that we'll discuss in the next couple of slides. Now I'll move on to the manufacturing industries, which has a pretty interesting story. Now, as you can see here, we've got food, beverage, tobacco, or FMCG, chemical, petrol area, metal, automotive, and other manufacturing industries. Obviously, again, similar to other industries, this has been in decline from about the early start of the decade till about 2017, 2018, and then we're starting to see a little bit of a pickup in most of these here, apart from the chemical petroleum area. Now, what's happening in the news at the moment? The big story is that a lot of people are thinking that manufacturing industry is dying, especially in Australia, with the shutdown of certain big automotive plants here shutting down and moving overseas. I think that's a very hot topic, and that's something that spread like wildfire in the news, in the media. But what's really happening is that it's not, the manufacturing industry in Australia isn't really shutting down. It's just going through a phase at the moment. So what's happening is that globally manufacturing is going through its fourth industrial revolution, which everyone's just calling Industry 4.0. With the first industrial revolution happening back in Europe, where things are being produced on a mass level, they were still being produced by hand by people. The second industrial revolution happened, I believe started in America with Henry Ford and the assembly line, and the third industrial revolution happened in the 60s and 70s, where these assembly lines being starting to be done by machine, where people were being replaced with machines and computers. What we're finding now is that with Industry 4.0, the big change is that these computers and machines are still there, still essentially being replacing human hands, but they're actually starting to get smarter. In the third industrial revolution, the computers that are controlling machines were still being input and being controlled by humans. They still have to be watched and monitored there. But nowadays, their computers are getting smarter. So they're using big data, they're using advanced logic, advanced AI in order to make these machines more efficient, better processes, and use less resources as well, which obviously is better for the bottom line. And also an interesting part is that with advancement in technology, these machines are starting to talk to each other as well. So if you can think about it, in the assembly line, you've got machine A talking to, and then machine B. So a product goes from machine A to machine B in previous times, but now machine A is talking to machine B, and therefore creating a more centralized and seamless solution there. So that's an interesting thing that's happening in the globe at the moment. And obviously Australia is going through the same thing. They're competing with a lot of manufacturing companies overseas, and therefore it's affecting the market at the moment. Salaries in the manufacturing industry did see a decline, again, in line with what everything's happened with the rest of the industries, but it is something that's comparable to the rest. So it's not something it's not drastically changed in the last decade. I'll move on to anything to add to that, Sam?
No, I was just going to say that obviously, salaries have come off in line really with the broader salary decline through that period. And there's no doubt, you've talked about AI and the impact now that machines are having in the production line. I would also say that the cost of labour in Australia is far higher in a manufacturing world than other parts of the world, and obviously we need to be competitive. And labour is a huge cost in the manufacturing space. So it's just balancing. It's balancing those requirements from a manufacturing perspective to be competitive still in a global economy. But I think those salaries have really come off in line with what we're seeing more broadly across the decade.
That's right. And also a big change to the labor within the manufacturing industry is that I think in the last 30, 40 years or so, it's been synonymous with low-skilled laborers who do repetitive tasks, whereas now it's changing with the advent of the technology. People in the manufacturing industry are now less low-skilled, and now they're quite highly skilled actually, because they have to have those skills to to understand the advancement, understand the technology, and understand the changes in the processes, and make sure that they add more value to the company. So it's quite an interesting change that manufacturing is going through at the moment, and we can see that as well. We'll move on to construction now. In construction engineering, this also has a pretty interesting story. Construction work is generally segregated into 4 areas: residential, non-residential, infrastructure, and heavy industries. And what we found in the last, as you can see from this chart, is that from 2012 to 2017, again, we see a drastic decline there. And when you look at the 4 separate areas on its own, you can see that Australia was seeing a decline in infrastructure and construction and heavy industries, which is quite big, from 2013 to 2017. Now, the residential work has actually steadily increased in 2012. However, it wasn't enough to offset the decline in the 2 other major areas. So that was a big factor in what we can see here in the decline in salary growth in those industries, in the construction industry as a whole.
Charles, this graph surprises me a little bit. I always thought construction costs, given the demand of infrastructure and residential requirements, required that you would see salaries increase through that period because of the higher demand for those skills. But it's interesting that it looks like it's sort of back on the way up, and perhaps 2017 was really the bottom. But with large-scale infrastructure projects, particularly being funded by governments in the public sector, or public-private relationships or partnerships, as they call them, plus the residential growth, particularly units. The growth in the Meritons of the world, you certainly would have expected, I think, this to be reversed, but perhaps we have seen that dip from 4.5% to 2.5% in 2017, and on the way back up to around 3% today, which is higher than, it is still higher than the average, that around that 3%, but still I would expect it to have sort of been a bit more of a flatter line or slightly ahead.
Correct. That's it. And you're absolutely right. I think the infrastructure and heavy industries are likely are forecast to increase in the next few years. So we are obviously seeing that tick there. And I think the residential is starting to pick up as well, or still continuing to pick up. So we're all in line with the others. It's starting to increase. So let's move on to our services areas. Sam, would you like to?
Yeah, services is an interesting one, and I think this is where the big growth in the economy has been. We talked a little bit about manufacturing, perhaps going through massive change. Services has also gone through a huge change, and I think what we've seen from the global pandemic, and certainly Australia's experience, is that services have been hit pretty hard because we are now a services-based economy, and I don't know what percentage the economy is built around services, but I do know it's the largest, certainly largest contributor now. And I think what's interesting here is we've seen obviously government remain fairly consistent in terms of around between 3 to 4% every year, which is not uncommon. Governments typically, there's always an increase typically in salary, and it's fairly consistent. But one of the interesting things that I think what we've seen is certainly the rise of professional services, business and professional services, and really that increase from 2017. And I think as the economy is becoming more attuned to a professional services style economy where we can provide services around the globe, we've got great skills in this country, particularly white collar services workers, and being able to connect not just nationally around Australia, but also internationally and compete and win business to provide those sorts of services around the world. So there's been a huge growth in that area. And I do note that where there's been a lot of layoffs, certainly through this pandemic, has been in the services industry. PwC and Deloitte combined have just made redundant about 1,500 consultants. I think Deloitte had 700 and PwC had somewhere around that as well. And that was a huge increase in consulting work that they were doing. And obviously through the global pandemic, that's really eased off, and they're worried about what that future pipeline looks like. But that's certainly where we've seen that big increase in 2017. And obviously where there's an increase in supply, there's an increase in demand. And that's pushed the salaries higher to the extreme of being almost running at 4.5% every year for the last 4 years, which has been a pretty significant growth in salary for people in that role. Whereas the rest of the economy really has been fairly consistent in salary growth between that 3 to 4%. And one of the interesting things here as well from a services perspective, I might just add, is the banking line. We all talked about coming out of that GFC in sort of 09, 010. We didn't have a recession here, but the financial industry was significantly impacted. What we saw was a bit of a run up out of that global financial crisis. So you can see where the demand came back in for those sorts of roles between 2011 and 2012 is where those demand for financial services role that perhaps may have been lost in 2008, 2009, 2010 came back into the economy. So we saw that increase from around 3.5 to 4.5% in the early part of the decade. And then it's sort of tailed away ever since to a more normal 3%. But yeah, it's an interesting to graph this one, and I certainly think this is a really telling one because services now are so dominant across the Australian economy. The services sector is critical to the operation of GDP and also to the Australia's economy more broadly. So yeah, some really interesting insights out of the National Salary Survey across services during the decade.
Yeah. So we'll move on to still within the salary growth, but now move on to salary growth by state.
Yeah, what we've seen here is, I think, I can't remember what they used to call it. I was trying to think a little bit earlier. A patchwork economy, I think, is what Kevin Rudd or someone used to say, where the mining and resources industry were flying and the rest of the economy was really struggling, or a two-speed economy, they used to say, two-speed economy. And that's really what we've seen here in the early part of the decade. From between 2011 to around 2014, we saw WA consistently outpace the rest of the states, and really WA and Queensland. So you can see Queensland is that yellow line, and WA is sort of that orange line at the top. And we were seeing the state-based salary growth of around 5% peak in 2013, and that was when that two-speed economy was happening, where resources were flying, and the rest of the economy was sort of just chugging along and trying to maintain its way out of a recession or a recessionary environment from the global financial crisis. So what we've seen is that more normalised as the resources industry has come back a little bit. Obviously, resources, we're exporting more coal and iron ore than we've ever exported before today than we did, in previous years. But it certainly has normalised that huge growth has come back, and so what you can see now is a fairly consistent approach across all of the states as we leave the decade, albeit Victoria is still slightly ahead of the other states. One of the states that always, I feel, Charles, misses out is South Australia and the Northern Territory, which we look at as a block. And every year we obviously do these webinars, and I always feel for South Australia because it's typically at the bottom end and of the salary growth. I'm not sure what commentary you can provide around that, Charles. We certainly don't want to offend any South Australians or Northern Territorians, but certainly they've generally felt it. Having said that, being a Queenslander myself and looking at that yellow line now at the bottom, I'm a little bit nervous, Charles.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have nothing really to add to that. Yeah, same thing. That feels kind of sorry for South Australia, Northern Territory. It just declines constantly, and yeah, just not in a good position.
Perhaps that uptick a little bit is I know the defence contracts are now operating in South Australia, and I know there's a lot of local work being brought in. And actually, I was speaking to our South Australian our South Australian regional manager, Debbie Constable, down there the other day, and Debbie said, look, there's a huge number of influx of interstate people coming into South Australia, really to get jobs for the submarines and some of those defence contracts. So I just note that there's a bit of an uptick there. Whether that's as a result of a more broader economic expansion through those defence contracts, I'm not sure, but so hopefully we might see a bit of a recovery. But yeah, it does look like each of the states, as the growth rate is around between around that 3 to 3.5%.
Okay, I thought that it'd be interesting to look at the key roles, the roles that have increased and decreased in the last decade. And what we're seeing here is the 3 key roles that have increased the most. And we're looking at the events manager, sales manager, and facilities manager positions, which have increased on the average about 4% a year. And the actual change from 2010 to 2020 has been around that 50% mark, with events managers topping the list at 53%. Now, this is quite interesting because what we've seen is that in recent years, events management as a whole, the industry as a whole has been increasing. I guess the idea of having a professional team or professional individual to organize your special event is becoming more popular, especially when you think about social media being a really powerful tool to market your business and to market yourself. Having those events that are beautifully done, well presented, it makes it a really impressive thing to be done, outsourced. The organizations that are trying to outdo each other in terms of events and parties can be a powerful marketing tool, because when you have that on your Instagram page and your LinkedIn and Facebook, it's just one of those things that people are very, it's very impressive, eye-catching. So that's something that we've seen. And as you can imagine, this then brings in more business, which ties into the sales managers being increased, and also facilities and managers having to support those events and those functions. That's quite an interesting thing to look at there.
Charles, I might just jump in. We talked a little bit just previously about the services industry. It's interesting that those 2 top roles are really roles built around the service industry. An events manager, from most good services businesses have events to promote themselves and their services. A lot of them employ events managers to do that critical promotion work. And obviously a sales manager is essential to a services industry. You need good salespeople in your business to sell your services. So it's interesting that those 2 roles that have, both had almost 50% in growth over the decade, I think are certainly supported or underpinned by an increasing services dominated economy.
Yeah, that's right. Now we'll have a look at the 3 key roles that have increased the least. Unfortunately, the marketing manager, senior business analyst, and group product manager. These 3 have increased an average of about 1 to 2% every year. And then the change there from marketing manager and senior analysts are around the 11 to 12%, and with the group project manager not changed much. The group product and brand manager actually did go up and down throughout the years, but what we've found is that it's just always consistently gone up and down and stayed within that 1% increase. And what we found is that the marketing area is quite a big job sector in the Australian labour force, with basically the staff and marketing teams becoming a more integral part of the Australian businesses. We've seen a higher than average annual growth rate in terms of actual staff and marketing professionals in the Australian labour force, compared to the rest of the labour force. But what might be the cause of this is that there's an oversupply then of professionals out there, and therefore there's quite a bit of competition. Therefore, the salaries don't really increase that much in terms of that. And a similar story can be found in the finance sector. Again, finance is a very integral part of the Australian business, and there could be an oversupply of these positions out there in the market.
Yeah, I would just add, surprised those roles are in there, Charles. I thought there'd be a little bit more, probably more manufacturing style roles, but but they are certainly marketing, perhaps as you said, oversupply. Business analysts, once again, I think sort of financial services has continued to grow with the superannuation industry more so, but yeah, perhaps once again an oversupply of graduates coming in and just reducing those increases year on year.
Yeah. Okay, move on to the next section we'd like to talk about is staff turnover. So this is basically within the National Salary Survey, we actually ask organizations what their average annual staff turnover rate is. And when we talk about staff turnover, it's more like the more important piece is that voluntary staff turnover. So, or staff members that have voluntarily left the company for various reasons. Now, when we're looking at this, we can see here that the total staff turnover is on average has relatively declined. It started off in the decade around the 16-17% and ended in the decade around the 14-15% mark. And what you can see here is that the voluntary staff turnover rate, the blue line, has actually declined somewhat from 2012 at the start to about, again, 2017, and then started to increase in 2017 onwards. And then inversely, involuntary staff turnover has kind of the reverse effect, where it's increased from 2011 to about 2017, and then bottomed out after 2017. It's kind of interesting because the part of the reason might be because that organizations have started to see the impact of their voluntary turnover rates. Key staff leaving the company, taking out all those valuable resources, that knowledge, that experience that they had and they've grown and developed within the company, and taking that to their competitors. It's quite a dangerous thing when you think about it, because it's a lot of loss of revenue, a lot of loss of company knowledge, but also the impact that the people have with their relationships, the lower morale, the key contacts and the key clients that they take along with them to the competitors. That has a huge impact on the business as a whole. So I think businesses have started to pick up on that, started to value their staff more, and try to keep them as much as possible. And we can kind of see that in 2017, it's starting to, the involuntary staff turnover rate has started to decrease.
Yeah, Charles, I would add that what I've certainly seen since being a part of the National Salary Survey over the last 6 years is that in good economic times, you see it increase. People leave and take a better job for more pay at a competitor. In tough economic times, people will hold on to the job they've got. And so, I think this stat in particular is really a figment of the economic situation. I wouldn't be surprised if that red line doesn't start going up pretty drastically after this pandemic.
Exactly. Okay, and we'll move on to the top three reasons for leaving. So within the organization, within the salary survey, we also asked organizations, what are the main reasons? What are the top reasons that staff give when they leave the company? And over the decade, the top three have always been to seek a new challenge, the limited career advancement opportunities, and insufficient financial rewards or insufficient salaries. Other top reasons are just logistically difficult, conflict with managers and staff members, and lack of development and training. We'll have a look at some other ones for now and come back to this, because it's quite an interesting thing the top three has an interesting story there. So Sam, would you like to go over these three things here?
Yeah, I think certainly the other reasons for leaving here, insufficient non-financial rewards. We've talked about that, more broadly coming as the economy really, I think, expanded through that 2012, 2013. But the key point here, I think I'd like to look at is the blue and yellow lines of the flexible work arrangements, and probably that push from perhaps mid-decade for organisations to start embracing more flexible work arrangements. And you can see that people have been more inclined to leave the organisation in the last 5 years because the flexibility is not offered and the flexibility is not there. And I think that's been a key driver through this decade. And if I think back, to 2008 or 2009, and I look at the workplace today, clearly, I think flexibility from managers and from organisations, from leaders in organisations, flexibility for their staff is absolutely critical. And you can see that people have been prepared to leave the organisation because flexible working wasn't available. So I think that's a really telling line, Charles, from around 2015. That certainly the yellow and blue lines there have been really the key drivers for perhaps that transition to force managers, force leaders, and force organisations to be prepared to be more flexible for their staff. Given that generally, certainly in families, both parents generally work these days, so that requirement there to be flexible, and also younger people, wanting to work from home, wanting to be a little bit more transient. The rise of better technologies, as we've seen through this global pandemic. Charles and I never dreamed of doing this webinar, in different rooms. I always flew to Sydney, or he always came to Brisbane to do the webinar. And the technology is there to be able to do that. And as we've done every meeting, for the last 3.5 months on Zoom or Microsoft Teams. So the technology is there to create the flexibility, but it has been driven by, I think, the need for people to want that flexibility, and have forced, the hands of managers and leaders and organizations to adapt to that.
Exactly. And just on the technology point, I was actually talking to a friend of mine recently, and the first year I started in the company, it was Australian Institute of Management back then. I started with a desktop with only one screen, and you'd never think about working from home because the technology wasn't there to access your files, access your hard drives. And in fact, we were actually faxing some marketing collateral back then. This was back in 2009. And you think about it now, a lot of organizations have moved on from that, having a stationary desktop, and this is your desk, to now we're seeing a lot more organizations who have hot desking, and everyone has a laptop because they can move easily from meeting room to meeting room and move along there, and the entire time still being connected to the network rather than being a hardwired thing. And because of that need and that flexibility within the company, within the physical office, you can easily translate that and use that technology to then work virtually as well, which is something that you think 10 years isn't a long time, but when you're talking about technology, that actually is quite a long time, and we're seeing a lot of advancement in the last 10 years. And yes, you're absolutely right. With the pandemic, that has really forced our hand in that, when we're seeing that, yes, we can actually do that. It's not just a few key people within the company who can work remotely. Literally now, everybody, in the organization, I'm pretty sure has had some sort of way to work from home, and we're seeing that it is possible. We can move on. It's a change that we have to get used to, but we can then make that change, move on, and still add value, and still work, and still provide great service and products. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So the next thing, so we'll go back to the top 3 reasons now, and the reason why is because of the actual trends that we're seeing here. As you can see, as I mentioned earlier, the number 1 position has always been a new challenge. Organizations or staff members who leave a company in order to either go to a different role within an organization or change completely, is just new challenge seems to be the main reason that the people are citing. The next one would be, and then what we're seeing here is that new challenge as a reason has been steadily kind of the same in the last decade. It's kind of stuck in that mid 70-75% or so, going up and down here and there, but it's still kind of a bit consistent there. What we're seeing, which is quite interesting, is that insufficient financial reward, that yellow line, i.e. salaries, has actually been declining as a reason for staff leaving the company, dropping from about 52% to about 42% from 2011 to 2020. Quite an interesting thing there. I think part of the main driver for that is that the declining salary salary growth, which we reviewed earlier in the webinar, is that declining salary growth has made salaries not really a huge factor to stay in the company anymore. They're actually, using there are different ways of getting higher salaries, and that brings me to the red line, which is limited career advancement opportunities. That's actually started to increase from 2011 to 2020. It's quite interesting because when you think about the declining salary growth, the way to move up, the way to get those higher salaries is not by asking those pay rises and not relying on annual salary increases, but it's really to get that promotion, to move that next level. That's how you get those higher salaries. What people are starting to realize is that's the real reason. That's the way to move up in the world. And if the organization can't provide that, then they're better off moving to another company, moving to, unfortunately, the competitor. And again, that comes into play with how much the organization loses when they lose that key staff and lose that key talent. And most of the time, it is those key talent and those really motivated, really experienced people that know their worth. They're the ones that are actually constantly looking at other positions, knowing how much they can hire, they can get paid when they look elsewhere. But it's really something that organizations should really think about when you think about turnover rates. Sorry, Sam, you're
Charles, I'll just jump in quickly. And normally when we're in the same room, you can hear me, but I've just got to unmute myself. There's a lot of questions coming in, so I would encourage people to send in the questions because we're going to get to them in a couple of minutes. What I would say on this is you're exactly right. People are, when they're employed, certainly are looking at how can the organisation develop the skills that I've got. And I think that's what you're seeing is people will leave an organisation where they don't feel like they're being challenged or developed. Financial reward is one thing, and obviously people want to be paid what they think they're worth, but also at the end of the day, I think people will make a sacrifice to be paid a little bit less if they feel like they're being put in a role that challenges them and they're being given tasks and opportunities to grow their careers. So it is a really interesting stat that this graph's really interesting, but that red line is certainly fairly telling in my eyes.
Yeah. So when you think about it, the question is that how do organizations then provide that career advancement? How do they make their staff feel that they're being challenged, that they're growing within the company? And the answer really is training and development. When you think about organizations that have the ability to give those promotions, give those higher salaries, they typically have higher revenues, therefore giving them higher budgets, which enables that. And the way to do that is by your organization getting the most out of your staff, right? In all departments, if your staff members and your teams are providing more value to the company, your company is going to grow, and they're going to be able to reach those targets, reach those stretch targets, but also find efficiencies in the company and save costs, therefore giving you a higher profits. So training development is the key to that. When you develop and train your staff, they grow more, they grow with the company, they feel valued, but they can also add more value to the company, therefore growing as a whole. What we're finding, unfortunately, though, is that in the last decade, unfortunately, training has been declining. We asked in the National Salary Survey, we asked organizations who has a formal training policy. Simple yes or no question. And unfortunately, the proportion of organizations that have a training policy has been declining in the last decade. So it started in 2011 with about 63%, 64, 63%, and it's dropped down in 2019 to about that 52% or so. It's gone up slightly from 2019 to 2020, which is a good sign. But with this pandemic and the recession that we're seeing at the moment, hoping that it stays up there and sees a tick. But I think training is one of those things that's quite expendable in terms of leadership eyes, and it's an unfortunate thing. When we look at the next slide, we look at the value of training budget. This is also declining as well. So we're seeing that in 2012, it started off as 2,200,000, and now we're seeing at 2020 it's dropped down to 153,000, which is almost a 30% decrease there in the value of training budgets. So of course, not only has the formal training policies have been declining, organizations with formal training policies have been declining, but also the value of those training budgets have been declining as well, which means you can do less with the formal training policies you already have. Another interesting thing to look at is the average number of induction days that's related to in organizations. And what we're seeing here is that there's also a decline in that across the board. And when you think about it, induction is what those first few days that you have in the company. When an employee starts in the company, they introduce their team members, their role, their role within the wider organization as well, how it ties into it, and this introduction to the company culture and everything else within the company that you need to know. Now, you're not going to be expected to know everything within those 30 days, but it's a really good start. It's a really good way to welcome your new staff members, really good way for them to be able to connect to and meet the people that they were going to work with for the
Okay, well, we seem to have lost Charles. Looks like his battery's gone flat, which is not ideal. And as I said, this is what happens in remote times. But what I will do is continue. We've got 3 minutes to go, and I've got a lot of questions here that have come through that I need to answer before we finish today's session. I do know, obviously, Charles's slides have stopped there on the induction of training days. What I was going to say there, certainly it was interesting that across all of those tiers of management, certainly they're very similar in the induction periods between 3 to 5 days. And as Charles was saying, you can only absorb what you can in 3 days, but certainly, that's it's an interesting stat that senior management, really have the same induction days as salaried staff. So let's move on to the questions. I know there was some questions a little bit earlier. Does the National Salary Survey break down salary increases by industry, Samantha? Yes, it does. So we went through some of those industries a little bit earlier. So I hope that answered some of your questions that you were looking for on that. But yes, it breaks down salary growth by industry in a very detailed manner. Mary's asked, when was the National Salary Survey released? Mary, we released it in late May. So it's about a month, about 5 weeks old now since we released it. We do another release in October. So every year we release it twice, once at the end of May, once at the end of October. So 6 months apart. And that's when we do it. So the data is always fresh and the data is always coming in. So we've always got contributors putting in data and we try to get that out to the market every 6 months. Russell has asked, what impact has the super guarantee had on salaries as it's risen from 3% to 9.5%? Russell, that's a good question. I think the super guarantee was 9% at the start of the decade. I don't recall it being only 3%. I think it's gone up by 0.5% through the decade. I might be wrong on that, but I did think the super guarantee was at around 9% at the beginning of the decade. It has gone up. And the way many organisations did adapt to superannuation, that increase was that some of them did increase the salaries, but some was absorbed into the super guarantee. So The impact on the salary growth rates was fairly negligible, and we didn't see that because it was only really 0.5% over a couple of years. But certainly we do take superannuation into account, and the 9.5% superannuation guarantee, which it is now. And certainly it hasn't had a huge impact on salary growth because it's generally part of an employee's package, the super guarantee. Donna has asked the question, I may have missed it, but is the healthcare industry included in this year's salary survey? Donna, I believe it is. Healthcare is a sector in the salary survey. It wasn't covered today. It wasn't because it wasn't one of those standout industries that we'd seen. We obviously tried to look at some of those more in tuned rates, so some of those higher netting industries through the quarter. Yes, that's what we've seen for the decade. And certainly what we have seen is we've tried to look at some of those key industries in growth, and really tried to highlight those in today's session rather than focusing on it. But healthcare is certainly an area. Has the data been collected in the same month every year? No, Nerida, it's not collected in the same month. It's collected throughout the year. Have you seen any trends on salaries since the pandemic started? Charles, are you with us now? No, he's not in. But have we seen? Yes, we have started to collect some trends. It's probably too early, Nerida, to go into what those trends mean. Yes, we probably will start to get a read in October on the impact of the pandemic, and we expect to see some of those lines, particularly in voluntary redundancies and things like that, moving up. But certainly we haven't got a read on what that looks like at this stage. But certainly we will have that for the October release. I think there's a couple more questions here, but I'm conscious that we're just past time. I'm sorry about some of these difficulties that we've had for the webinar, but I hope that we've given you a great insight into what the National Salary Survey can do and the statistics that it provides. We certainly are very open to hearing questions from you and further insight. So if you would like more information on the National Salary Survey, please email us directly, michelle.elkin@managersandleaders.com.au, michelle.elkin@managersandleaders.com.au. Michelle's ready and waiting, and she's ready to answer any of the questions you've got. So that's KAN at managersandleaders.com.au, and Michelle's ready and waiting. Otherwise, please get in touch with us on the 1300 number through the website, and also we'd always love to hear your thoughts and your questions about the NSS. We're obviously very reliant on our purchasers to be, and you know, we've had some very long-standing clients through the National Salary Survey, so we do always welcome new contributors. So please feel free to get in touch about that. But once again, thank you very much for today's session. I'm sorry that we've had some of these technical issues at the end, but I hope we've given you a great snapshot of what the NSS can offer. Thank you very much for your attention today, and we look forward to seeing you soon.